For a
right, children,
child boarding
please
an
step up
overnight
quickly.
train at Boston's
Mama,
North
where are we
Station
going?
in the early
Just hold your
1950s,
luggage, darling. We
summer
need to
camp
move.
did not begin at the front gate. It began somewhere in the dark, in a sleeping car rattling north along the Connecticut River, when the city finally let go. Camps in the Vermont and New Hampshire mountain region drew heavily from Boston, Providence, and the towns of southern New England, and for decades the journey there was inseparable from the experience itself. Families who chose this region were, in many cases, choosing it specifically. The White Mountains and Green Mountains had already been summer destinations for New England households since the mid-19th century, long before any camp existed to organize a child's stay in them. The train followed routes the Concord and Montreal Railroad had run since the 1880s, past small clapboard depots that seemed to shrink with every mile north. Accounts from the era describe the particular quality of that crossing. A few hours in which a city child watched brick give way to farmland, farmland give way to forest, and forest finally give way to the first unmistakable shape of a mountain on the horizon. At the station nearest camp, counselors were often waiting on the platform itself, calling out cabin assignments before the trunks had even been unloaded. From there, the final approach was usually by camp truck or open-backed vehicle, along dirt roads that climbed steadily until the trees broke and a lake appeared below, ringed by hardwood forest, already beginning, in some years, to show its first hints of early color. For a child who had never seen a mountain up close, the moment of arrival carried a specific charge, not just a new place, but a new scale of place entirely. The cabin was smaller than expected, and louder, and stranger, 6 or 8 beds instead of 1, a counselor barely older than an oldest sibling, and a screen door that would slap shut 100 times before the summer ended. Camp histories from this region describe the first night with a consistency that suggests it was never really unique to any one camp. The unpacking of a trunk under unfamiliar light, the assignment of a top or bottom bunk, the sudden, sharp awareness of exactly how far away home actually was. For many children, this was among the first nights of their lives spent outside their own house entirely. The sounds were part of what made it disorienting. A lake at night carries differently than a city street. The call of a loon, wind moving through hemlock and birch, the structural creak of a wooden cabin settling into cooler air. Where a child from Boston or Providence might have expected silence, mountain camps offered instead a different kind of noise entirely, one that took most of a first week to stop sounding like something to be afraid of. Homesickness, when it appeared, rarely lasted through breakfast. Counselors, themselves usually college students home for the summer, some returning for a 3rd or 4th year in the same role, had seen the pattern enough times to know roughly how it moved. Sharpest in the first hours of darkness, softer by the second night, and, for most children, largely gone by the time the first full day of camp activity began. What remained, according to accounts passed down through camp alumni networks, was the specific memory of that first night's particular unfamiliarity, a discomfort that, decades later, former campers often describe with more clarity than almost anything that came after it. Within a day or two, the trunk that had seemed impossibly full at home began to reveal what a mountain camp actually required. Hiking boots, wool socks even in July, a rain shell, and a canvas pack sized for a day trail rather than a weekend suitcase. This was the detail that separated a Vermont or New Hampshire mountain camp from the flatter lake camps of Maine. The packing list itself told a story. Alongside the swimsuit and the canoe cushion sat equipment meant for granite trails and unpredictable weather, items that a child attending a waterfront-only camp would never have needed at all. Mornings at camp settled into rhythm quickly. A bell or bugle call, a cabin cleanup inspected with mock seriousness by a counselor only a few years older than the oldest camper. Then breakfast in a dining hall that smelled, according to alumni recollections, permanently of wood smoke and warm syrup. The waterfront program that followed breakfast was, in its basics, the same structure found at nearly any lake camp of the era. The swim test that sorted children into ability groups, the supervised free swim period, canoe instruction along the shoreline in flat water before anyone was trusted farther out. But even here, The specific geography of the region shaped the experience. Lakes like Squam and the larger Winnipesaukee offered more open water than the smaller Maine camp ponds, conditions that supported small boat sailing alongside the standard canoeing that dominated camp waterfronts elsewhere. For a child raised in a Boston suburb, the ordinary act of tying a bowline or reading wind on open water was, quietly, one more form of the same independence the mountains themselves were teaching just a few hours later in the day. The first day hike rarely went far, and camps in this region seemed to have designed it that way on purpose. A short trail, a modest summit or overlook, a round trip that could be completed comfortably between breakfast and lunch, enough to introduce the specific demands of granite terrain without asking too much of legs still adjusting to camp's daily schedule. What made even a short White Mountain Trail different from a lakeside nature walk was the sensation of actual elevation gain. Accounts from former campers described the specific progression of a mountain hike: hardwood forest thinning gradually into softer conifer, footing shifting from packed dirt to root and stone, and finally the abrupt, often startling moment when the trees simply stopped and open granite began. That treeline moment appears again and again in recollections of mountain camp hiking, regardless of which specific peak or trail is being described. For a child from a flat New England suburb, it was frequently the first time elevation had ever been felt in the body, rather than simply observed from a car window. The thinning air, the wind arriving without warning, the valley suddenly visible as a single connected shape, rather than a series of separate, familiar places. Counselors leading these hikes were often the same college-age staff who ran the waterfront, trading a whistle and a swim test for a trail map and a weather eye on the presidential range. Some had grown up attending the same camp themselves, returning summer after summer until they knew a given trail's difficulty in July, as well as they knew their own cabin. Coming down was its own experience, legs tired in a way the waterfront never produced, and, waiting below, the specific comfort of a valley that now looked for the first time like it might actually be home for the summer. By the second or third week, the waterfront had stopped being a place of tests and started becoming something closer to the center of daily life. On lakes as open as Squam and Winnipesaukee, camps in the region typically expanded their sailing programs beyond what smaller Maine or Adirondack ponds could support, giving older campers access to small sailboats once basic canoe and swim skills had been demonstrated. Learning to read wind on open water was, according to camp program descriptions from the period, treated with almost as much structure as the mountain trail system, a progression from passenger to crew to, eventually, skipper of a small boat, each stage earned rather than assumed. A capsize in shallow water, followed by the unglamorous work of righting the boat and climbing back in, was itself considered part of the instruction rather than a failure of it. Canoe trips, meanwhile, pushed further along the shoreline than the first week's supervised laps had allowed. Half-day paddles to a swimming rock or picnic point, the specific rhythm of a full cabin group paddling in loose formation, voices carrying differently over water than they ever did on land. Afternoons often held free swim, a period loosely supervised but genuinely unstructured, in which campers were permitted the kind of unsupervised feeling play that a tightly scheduled morning program did not allow. Accounts from former campers describe this hour with particular fondness, not because anything remarkable happened during it, but because it was, within an otherwise structured day, theirs. By midsummer, a child who had arrived unable to swim confidently was, in many documented cases, paddling a canoe solo along the shoreline. Wind and water no longer strange elements to be feared, but simply the daily texture of where they now spent their time. The overnight trail trip was, for most mountain camp alumni, the single experience that separated a Vermont or New Hampshire summer from anything a flatland camp could offer. Multi-day trips into the Green Mountain backcountry or along extended White Mountain ridgelines gave older campers a sustained physical challenge that a single-day hike could only gesture toward. Preparation began days in advance, packs weighed and repacked, a route reviewed by counselors who had often walked it themselves as campers, weather watched with the specific attentiveness that presidential range conditions demanded. Camps in this region built real institutional knowledge around specific trails over decades. A counselor who could read the sky over the Franconia Ridge, or who knew exactly how the Crawford Path behaved after a July rain, was passing along expertise that had moved from one camp generation to the next. The trip itself unfolded across 2 or 3 days. A first day's climb to a lean-to or backcountry camping spot, dinner cooked over a fire built by the campers themselves under supervision, a night sky far darker and more crowded with stars than anything visible from the main camp waterfront. A summit push, when the route included one, often came on the second day. Hours of sustained upward effort rewarded, when weather cooperated, with a view extending across ridgelines that had, until that morning, existed only as names on a map. What former campers describe most consistently is not any single dramatic moment, but the accumulated, unglamorous effort of it. Sore shoulders from an ill-fitting pack, blistered feet by the second afternoon, and the specific satisfaction, arriving back at the lake camp 2 or 3 days later, of having done something the waterfront alone never could have offered. Rain, when it came, tended to become part of the story rather than a footnote to it. Accounts describe entire cabin groups sitting out an afternoon downpour under a lean-to roof, playing cards or simply waiting, learning in the process that discomfort on a trail was survivable in a way that was harder to teach at the lakeside waterfront alone. Counselors used these moments deliberately, according to camp program notes from the era, treating bad weather not as an interruption to the trip, but as a genuine part of what the mountains were meant to teach. If the trail system gave mountain camps their distinct physical character, the evening campfire gave them their emotional rhythm. Accounts from across camps in this region describe a strikingly similar evening structure, the day's activity winding down toward dinner, a fire built at a fixed spot near the waterfront or in a forest clearing, and a gathering that mixed songs, mild ceremony, and the kind of unstructured talk that a full daytime schedule rarely allowed. Camp songs varied from institution to institution, but the function they served was consistent, a shared ritual that every cabin group, regardless of age, could take part in equally. Older counselors, some of them former campers themselves, often led these evenings with a familiarity that suggested they had sat in the exact same spot as children a decade or more earlier. Mail call held its own particular weight. Letters from home arrived on a schedule tied to camp mail, runs into the nearest town, and their delivery, usually announced by name, in front of the whole group, carried an emotional charge disproportionate to the brief pieces of paper themselves. A letter meant a specific, physical connection to a home that had, by midsummer, started to feel pleasantly distant rather than urgently missed. Writing home was its own ritual, one camps typically built directly into the daily or weekly schedule rather than leaving to chance. The letters campers sent, according to family collections preserved from the era, tended to follow a recognizable pattern: brief accounts of a hike or a canoe trip, a request for something forgotten in the trunk, and, increasingly as the summer went on, a confidence and ease that had not been present in the first week's homesick letters home. By the fire each night, in songs and mail and quiet talk, the mountain camp community rebuilt itself, one evening at a time. Not every hour of a mountain camp day was spent on a trail or in a canoe. Craft periods, cabin games, and organized sports filled out the schedule. And it was often in these lower-stakes hours, not the dramatic summit pushes, that the closest cabin friendships actually took shape. One piece of material culture appears repeatedly in accounts of this specific region: the hike record board, a hand-lettered list, usually kept in the dining hall or main lodge, tracking every peak a cabin group had climbed over the course of the summer. Unlike the individual achievement badges common at many camps, the hike board recorded a collective accomplishment: this cabin, this summer, these mountains, and campers described checking it with a specific pride distinct from any individual award. Craft periods, by contrast, moved at a gentler pace. Leatherwork, woodworking, and simple camp handicrafts gave children a quiet counterpoint to the physical demands of the trail and waterfront programs, and the finished projects, a carved paddle, a leather bracelet, a small wooden box, often survived decades in family homes as one of the only physical objects remaining from a given summer. Team sports and cabin competitions, meanwhile, built rivalries that rarely outlasted the season but mattered intensely within it. Color war events, relay races, and evening games gave campers a different register of camp life entirely. Less about individual growth against a landscape, more about the simple, ordinary pleasure of being 12 years old in summer with the same 7 or 8 cabin mates, day after day. It was these accumulated ordinary hours, as much as any single mountain summit, that former campers describe when asked what camp actually felt like from the inside. By the final week, the summer had a texture entirely different from its first days. Campers who had arrived unable to identify a single peak on the horizon could now name most of them, and cabin groups that had been strangers in June moved through the last days of August with the specific ease of people who had shared something real. Many mountain camps in this region built a final hike or closing climb into the last days of the season, sometimes a return to the very trail a cabin group had attempted, with difficulty, in their first week, walked now with a confidence the same terrain had not allowed in June. Accounts describe this closing hike less as a physical challenge and more as a kind of quiet accounting. The same granite, the same treeline, but a noticeably different child moving across it. Trunks were packed in reverse of how they had arrived, the wool socks and rain gear now worn soft with use, tucked in alongside a leather bracelet or a carved paddle from craft period, a hikeboard entry copied by hand into a personal camp journal some children kept. Closing ceremonies, where camps held them, tended to be modest rather than elaborate. A final campfire, camp songs sung with a particular weight, given what the next morning would bring, awards or recognitions that mattered more for the shared moment than for the object itself. Counselors, many of whom would return the following June, moved through these last days with a different kind of attention than the anxious watchfulness of the first week. Less about managing homesickness, more about noticing, quietly, which campers seemed to be leaving something behind that mattered. Departure morning moved at a strange, doubled pace, too fast for anyone to properly say goodbye, too slow for the waiting to end. Trunks lined the road where the camp truck had first delivered them 8 weeks earlier. Addresses were traded on scraps of paper, and promises to write were made with the specific sincerity of children who, in most documented cases, genuinely meant to keep them. The train south followed the same route it had followed north in June, past the same small depots, the same river valley, the same gradual transition from mountain to forest to farmland to city. But accounts from former campers described the return journey as feeling nothing like the outbound one, not because the landscape had changed, but because the child moving through it had. What stayed with campers from these mountain summers, according to the accounts collected from camp alumni networks and family archives across the region, was rarely a single dramatic event. It was the accumulated, specific memory of altitude and effort, the tree line crossed for the first time, the granite underfoot, the exact tiredness of a long day's descent, followed by a hot dinner in a lakeside dining hall. It was friendships formed in a cabin of 7 or 8 strangers who became, by August, something closer to family. And it was a landscape, the white and green mountains, the lakes ringed by hardwood forest, that many former campers returned to for the rest of their lives, sometimes sending their own children to the same trails a generation later. The counselors who knew the presidential range by heart, the hikeboard in the dining hall, the smell of wood smoke on a first night away from home, these were never really separate from each other. They were the same summer, remembered from different angles, by children who had once stood at a tree line for the first time and felt, for a moment, exactly how large the world actually was. Some of these camps, according to regional camp histories, still operate today, among the oldest private camps in the country, still sending cabin groups up the same granite trails their grandparents once climbed, still keeping a hikeboard in the dining hall, even as liability standards, transportation, and family life have all changed almost beyond recognition since the 1950s. What has not changed, if the accounts of former campers are any guide, is the specific weight of that first tree line crossing, and the particular quiet of a lake seen for the first time from a hillside road.